It's a great pleasure to be here. Every time I come to Japan, I realize how comfortable I feel among so many gracious hosts, and it's just a great pleasure to come back again. I'm going to speak on the issue of how do we think about development, and I'm going to argue from my book that I wrote 20 years ago that we basically betrayed the idea of development. So the book was published in English in 1994, translated into Japanese by Kenji Takeuchi and others in 2003. And the basic argument of this book is, imagine that Darwin came before Newton. Imagine that we thought of science as an evolutionary process, thought of the world as an evolutionary creation, rather than a place of fixed parts in mechanical relations, predictable relations with each other. But we actually had concepts of systems of emergent properties. Would the world be different? Would we be thinking differently had Darwin come before Newton? And I argue that we would, that we'd be thinking quite differently, that we'd in fact develop a coevolutionary understanding of nature and our relationship with nature. We would be what I would call coevolutionists. I'd like to elaborate this first with this diagram, where we understand that natural systems are in interaction with social systems, and usually we think of those interactions as fairly direct linkages, that we cause pollution, nature causes storms, nature brings good weather, bad weather, but these are very sort of ecological linkages. They're sort of mechanical, direct linkages that we have between the social and the natural system. In a coevolutionary view, there's also evolutionary relationships, in that we are selecting on nature, and nature selects on us. That what we do as people puts selective pressure on natural systems, but natural systems also put selective pressure on social systems. Those are the red arrows. And by and large, a Newtonian view stresses the blue arrows, and the Darwinian blue stresses the red, and it's those red arrows that I'd like to stress. But it's important to remember that they occur together. So in biology, coevolution occurs when one entity selects on another, which is also selecting back on the original entity. So we usually think of evolution as a single species evolving to better fit a physical niche, but in fact, the niche of most species is a whole bunch of other species, that they're all evolving together, and they are in effect co-evolving. And it's that idea of everything responding and selecting on each other. In Development Betrayed, I put more emphasis on the social system, and I divide the social system into a value system, a knowledge system, organizational system. An organization would include governments, bureaucratic governments, it could include democracy, it includes markets and economic systems, it includes the bureaucratic organization of major firms, but social organization also includes families, communities, so all forms of social organization. So it's highly abstract. And I look at the technological system. I say these four components of the social system are co-evolving with each other, they're selecting on each other, and they're co-evolving with the environmental system or the natural system. So you get a diagram that looks like this, where these arrows are both what we might call ecological or mechanical relations, sort of the direct relations. So you can think of this as a great big ecosystem of interacting components. They're not just interacting components, they are also co-evolving components. So coevolution always occurs within a dynamic system. There's mechanical, dynamic, regular relationships, and then the coevolution is occurring on top of that. Coevolution has a surprising characteristic. We don't usually think of things being tightly connected and changing as components that go together. But in a co-evolving system, because everything is selecting in response to everything else, everything is co-evolving in response to everything else, each component reflects the characteristics of the other components. And so we get this tight integration between all the components. And usually when we think of tight linkage, we don't think of change. So the coevolutionary way of thinking has an immediate contrast with the way we usually think of systems as, something that's tightly interlocked can't also be changing. This is a fairly complete ontology. It provides a framework for helping explain the world, both social and natural. It helps us address where are we heading. It helps us understand the nature of ethics and what we should do, and decide how goals might best be reached, though in a very different way than in a Newtonian world. This ontology stresses relations, indeed changing relations, between entities and how entities change and emerge into wholly new entities. This is in contrast to Western science, starting with the Greeks, where the dominant worldview is that there are fundamental, unchanging, basic entities and relations. This is not to argue that there are not universal relations such as the first and second laws of thermodynamics, or that fundamental particles do not exist. But in Development Betrayed, I do not view the world as at this level of the basic particles and the basic relations. Nor do I presume that the world is simply built up from such a level. So we're speaking at a higher level of systems. In ecological systems, coevolution occurs between interacting species. Coevolution is evolution within ecology or other dynamic environmental-like system. So coevolutionary change in ecological systems occurs through species introductions and genetic mistakes that prove fit. A physical change in the environment that selects for a different mix of characteristics in one species can then change selective pressures on other species. In DB, the coevolutionary framework, change also occurs in social systems through change, random change, and mistakes, deliberate experimentation, and introductions of new characteristics from other social systems that prove fit. So the same drivers that we have in ecological systems that result in evolution, I'm positing the same things are happening in social systems. This ontology does not portray a nature that is simply out there, separate from people. For at least the last 2 centuries, perhaps the last millennium, at least here on planet Earth, people have been a significant part of the overall mechanical and evolutionary dynamics of nature. There is no nature-culture dichotomy in this framing. We're all together. This ontology, furthermore, does not allow an objective, godlike stance. This issue, however, does raise the question of where are we standing when we see this coevolutionary portrayal of socio-environmental reality. With respect to the difficulty of finding neutral ground to stand on, or objectivity, this framework shows how our past knowledge, values, social organization, and technologies affect what has come to be, while they also select for which sciences or ways of seeing affect what we see and how we might best act. Development Betrayed incorporates the good aspects of postmodernist understanding. Social organization, technology, values, and even science are socially constructed. Indeed, even nature is increasingly being socially constructed. But none are only socially constructed because they're also constructed by the natural system. Nature, its co-evolving components and processes, matter just as much as human history matters. So it's both histories interacting that explain where we are today. So I want to talk about, or give an example, and another speaker today will be talking about agroecology systems, natural harmony, soils, and how we work with soils. And for most of the last 2 centuries, our dominant understanding of soils has been a physical and chemical understanding. We thought of soils not as biological systems, but as chemical systems and physical systems. While we now understand soils more as biological systems or biogeochemical systems, our understanding of modern agricultural soils, the actual soils that are out there, is more complete, and thus better when we incorporate how we had historically transformed these systems through our earlier dominantly physical and chemical understanding of soils. And so we're in a situation where to understand nature today, we have to understand how we have understood nature in the past and changed its nature. We are part and we're inside this system. In this coevolutionary framing, understanding is strongest when it is recursive, incorporating its earlier self, our history of our prior understandings and actions taken, into what we understand, and thus what will be the more probable effects of our actions today. While this is important for understanding agricultural soils, it is even more important for understanding our economy. The economy and the problems we have today reflect our past understanding that was dominated by neoliberal economic thought on markets as if they were self-regulating markets. And of course, Adam Smith's famous metaphor, as if guided by an invisible hand, that metaphor has been incorporated into actual beliefs that markets are guided by an invisible hand, but of course they aren't. We need to regulate them, but we went through a period of thinking we did not, and we are now suffering those consequences. And so to understand where we are, we have to understand how we thought in the past. There's another important dimension that I bring out in Development Betrayed. For the vast majority of human history, there's been a changing patchwork quilt of co-evolving societies. Occasionally, species, values, knowledge, technology, and forms of social organization have been introduced from one society into another. Early people relocated plants, spreading rice, potatoes, corn, cassava, peanuts, and other plants across the continents, and a few animals. This process of ecological exchange accelerated after the development of more dependable ocean-going sailboats that led to the Age of Discovery, and became ever more important to the increase of the globe's capacity to support people. So it's those transfers, those introductions, that began to transform nature, and we were very much a part of that process. Colonization, and then the widespread adoption of fossil fuel technologies, blurred the patchwork quilt of co-evolving cultures. Post-World War II development, and more recently the globalization of capital, have entailed massive transfers of social organization and knowledge, and a substantial reduction in patchiness and diversity. So we're no longer a co-evolving patchwork quilt. We become a single co-evolving global system. And this has erased a lot of diversity. Thus, this co-evolutionary framework also helps explain how modern society got itself into such deep trouble over the past 2 centuries. For the vast majority of human history, human knowledge, values, organization, and technology co-evolved with the environment. But beginning about 2 centuries ago, they began to co-evolve around fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, fossil hydrocarbons, drove a wedge in the co-evolutionary process, replacing the environment in the short run, and modern societies began to co-evolve with fossil hydrocarbons. So our social organization, the knowledge we have, the values we hold, the technologies we use, are less connected with nature, less reflect nature than reflect petroleum and coal and natural gas. And this led to the co-evolution of economism and the industrial order we have today. And I love to talk about both economism and the industrial order we have today, but those are the topics of my next 2 books, and I'll have to skip through this, but I'm open to questions later. While fossil hydrocarbons drove the selection processes immediately affecting the coevolution of social systems, the environmental system undertook long-term global changes that have reset the stage for life on Earth. Since Development Portrayed was written, we have a much better understanding of anthropogenic climate change. It also has taken the effect much more quickly than we expected it would 2 decades ago. We are now beginning to see ourselves as being in a new geological era, the Anthropocene, where people are the major drivers of the Earth system. The coevolutionary framework is especially fit for understanding this new era. Had Darwin come before Newton, if we had understood the world as co-evolving in rather unexpected ways with emergent properties previously unseen, humanity would now be quite different, perhaps as follows. First, and I really want to stress this, when you think as an evolutionist, diversity is really important. It's the primary thing that comes to mind. Without diversity, the coevolutionary process comes to a halt. And so, just as in a mechanical way of thinking, you begin to stress efficiency, and economists today stress efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. When you're a coevolutionist, diversity, just by the nature of its pattern of thinking, it depends on diversity for the pattern to work, and so it becomes critically important. It takes on a value because of the way we think, just like efficiency takes on a value in a mechanical worldview or an economic worldview. This diversity between and within systems leads to greater resilience to perturbations in a coevolutionary sense. With a coevolutionary understanding, we might have avoided the Anthropocene altogether. If we were coevolutionists, we'd be better equipped to envision undoing the modern global system, taking it apart so its shriveled set of social and technological forms, and begin return to a co-evolving patchwork quilt. So most of us are not really thinking about this kind of a separation and undoing the global system we have, but I think to reach harmony with nature, nature is different in different places, and nature can continue to be different in different places, but not when we're locked in to the fossil hydrocarbon technologies and the same social ways of organizing. We need diversity to get diversity back into nature. We need to go back to a system that looks more like a patchwork quilt. Severing many of the linkages of the current global system, especially denying the immediate gains from trade and specialization, acknowledging the importance of community, and rebuilding systems of care at the expense of systems of material production will be very difficult. Fortunately, the coevolutionary framework helps us see this. To succeed, we would need to dramatically reduce our global environmental impacts on each other to co-evolve more independently. So on the one hand, the explanation shows how fossil hydrocarbons have transformed the globe, but to transform it back, we'd also have to just decouple ourselves. We'd also have to decouple our impacts on each other around the globe, and fossil hydrocarbons are the main factor that is currently coupling us environmentally, so the two work together. Back off from fossil hydrocarbons, back off from affecting each other, so we can co-evolve more apart. Second, I would argue, our mix of technologies would be quite different. Due to the value of diversity, we would deploy more technologies, different technologies. We'd also select technologies for the reversibility, for our ability to undo them, because our prior expectation that there might be undesirable consequences would be higher. We would expect to make mistakes, and in expecting to make mistakes, we would choose technologies that we could undo so that we could correct those mistakes. Furthermore, the technologies deployed, the industries we would build, would probably be more ecological. We would be working with ecological systems rather than trying to conquer them, rather than trying to force them in new directions. we'd have diverse ways of interacting. I would expect more deliberate and informed ecological interventions rather than after-the-fact, unforeseen ecological interventions or corrections. Third, our knowledge system would also be more diverse. This would partly because our knowledge would be more biological, where multiple explanatory models prevail. So in ecology, we have predator-prey models. We have energy systems models in ecology. We have evolutionary ecology, where evolution is stressed. We have food webs, biogeochemical cycles, landscape ecology. These are all different patterns of thinking. And those different patterns would lead to a diversity of technologies and emphasize, again, the diversity of ways of knowing. It would partly be because coevolutionists would be more respectful of the evolutionary processes that give legitimacy to traditional knowledge. Furthermore, in a rapidly changing system, experiential knowledge, our direct observations of nature and our social systems would be given more value. As the system is changing, it's hard to have scientific monitoring systems to know what to look for in an emergent world. Experience would be more important than now. And this would make knowledge more equitable. We could all participate. Fourth, with respect to social organization, a coevolutionary understanding probably would not have facilitated the dominance of the myth of the market. One of the things about markets is we always talk about markets as if markets are the way we organize. But in fact, we organize in corporations. We don't wake up every morning and say, where shall I sell my labor? Where shall I sell my capital? We make fixed contracts and have bureaucratic organizations called corporations. Command and control. So on the one hand, we worship markets and complain about command and control, but in fact, command and control is central to how we organize. And I think we could have more sophisticated thinking if we were coevolutionists, if we could see in multiple ways. I think with more ways of thinking, more forms of social organization would also then prove fit. With more technologies, we would need more forms of social organization to prove fit. Fifth, and here I speculate, but I think the dominance of me-first and materialistic economic thinking, along with the dominance of market organization in modern life, would be smaller. Diversity of values would have prevailed, indeed may have increased had Darwin come before Newton. Sixth, had a coevolutionary understanding arisen before the mechanical, there is a good chance that the greater diversity in values, knowledge, technology, and social organization that I hypothesize would be in place would also have had a more diverse selective pressure on environmental systems. It is possible that people would contribute to biological diversity rather than detract from it. And this is hard to imagine because we're so used to the idea that people harm the environment. But if we're living with the environment, and if we're living with the environment in diverse ways, we could also increase the diversity of nature, or at least vastly slow down our destruction of the diversity of nature. But I think we could actually increase it. And there is evidence that the diversity of the Amazon is due to the indigenous peoples that burned patches of the Amazon and created environments in which new species could emerge. So the coevolutionary way of thinking can lead us to think in a positive, constructive way also. Seventh, founding our thinking on a natural nature that is out there, to which we might approximately return, blocks us from understanding our real options. This is a little hard to explain. We went through this with the interpreters a little bit this morning, but we have the natural sciences. We have conservation biology. We have these ways of thinking that there is a nature out there. But if we are really a major force in the transformation of nature, as we are, then there isn't a nature out there. And yet, millennia of thinking about nature apart from us still gets in our way. And I think I can elaborate on that in just a moment. Eighth, and perhaps most importantly, the recursive nature of knowledge that is made clear through the DB's coevolutionary lens would pervade our understanding of the Anthropocene. The universal properties and dynamics characteristic of a mechanical level of understanding are not discoverable at the levels of complexity at which we actually must work, and expecting them to appear at this level gets in the way of our being effective. And so we're constantly looking for laws of nature at a level of ecological complexity, as if ecological systems were like physical systems, mechanical systems. We're constantly looking for laws of society and social organization, as if they were like the first and second laws of thermodynamics. And I think if we had the coevolutionary perspective, we would realize we're in systems which keep changing, keep having emergent properties, and we'd have to keep moving with those systems and updating our thinking, but we wouldn't be looking for long-term universal properties. We'd be constantly having to update our knowledge, but we wouldn't be looking for something that is there forever. Let me give some examples, or at least an example. I'm centrally engaged at the science policy interface of California's biggest environmental challenge: how to establish the institutions, the science programs, and the management strategies to continually resolve the unfolding environmental implications of delivering water from Northern California to Southern California. So California, most of its rainfall is in the northern half, most of its best agricultural land, and the majority of its people are in the southern half of the state. And so we have been moving water from the northern half to the southern half, and we move that water through what's called the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which is an inland delta. It's not a delta that's a fanning out to the sea, but it's a merging of multiple rivers inland that then go through a narrow channel out to the sea. And that delta is a rich environmental area, or at least it used to be, but it's been transformed heavily by people. And it will continue to be transformed with sea level rise, with invasive species, and human activity, farming in the delta. And we're now trying to figure out a way to move Northern California water through the delta. And the southern water interests are proposing a peripheral tunnel, a tunnel that would literally go under the delta. Those who are interested in the environment of the delta say, no, we want water to keep moving through the delta and let Southern California have it after it's gone through the delta. In this debate of how we're going to manage California's water, there's this ongoing tension because we can't really think as Californians about a delta that is constantly changing. We keep thinking about a delta ecosystem as it used to be in the past. We talk about ecological restoration. We talk about the use of natural science, of natural systems to inform us. We have conservation biologists saying we need to conserve the biology of the system. And yet that system will keep changing. We have an Endangered Species Act which says we need to save the species that are there. But in the Anthropocene, the species that are there need to move someplace else. And other species need to live in the delta. But we're having great difficulty staying ahead and moving into a changing future because our dominant scientific way of thinking comes out of the natural sciences, of a nature that's unchanging and not, it can only be degraded by people. And so when we want to do something good for it, we talk about going back to the past. But there's no going back to the past. We can only go forward. And then the question is, how do we move with nature? How do we change ourselves as nature changes us? And I think Development Portrayed helps us see that as our central dilemma in the age of the Anthropocene. Thank you.